The mess hall echoed with the clatter of trays and the scrape of boots on concrete floors. It was Texas, late 1943, and the air smelled faintly of flour and hot griddles. Rows of German prisoners filed in under the watchful eyes of American guards. Some were veterans of the Afrika Korps, men hardened by desert campaigns. Others were young soldiers taken in Italy, their faces still boyish beneath the dirt and fatigue. They carried themselves stiffly, clinging to the discipline of a lost cause. When the first plates were set before them, the reaction came like a wave. Stacks of soft, golden pancakes, steaming in the cool morning air, glistened with a drizzle of maple syrup. The prisoners burst into mocking laughter. They pointed, elbowed each other, jeered with the scorn of men convinced of their superiority. One shouted across the table in broken English, "This is breakfast for children." Maybe, another muttered to his neighbor. America fights with toys on their plates. Their voices carried through the hall, a chorus of ridicule, their laughter bitter and sharp. The contrast could not have been greater. For men who had grown up with dense loaves of Schwarzbrot black bread heavy with rye. Dark and unyielding, these soft cakes seemed absurd. A few banged their fists on the table in parody of celebration. One man, his voice dripping with sarcasm, declared loudly, "Behold the mighty American feast cakes for soldiers." The guards, standing at the periphery, exchanged glances, but said nothing. They let the prisoners laugh. Perhaps they understood what would follow. The room crackled with energy, the prisoners savoring their own disdain as if it were a final taste of pride. Their uniforms were ragged, their boots worn thin, but their sense of cultural superiority remained intact. They had come from a Europe on fire, where scarcity was a daily torment, where families starved under relentless bombing raids. Yet here they stood, sneering at abundance, too blind in that moment to see the irony. The camera lingers on their faces, some sneering, some smirking, some doubling over with exaggerated laughter. A prisoner wiped tears of mirth from his eyes, as though the very sight of pancakes were the funniest thing he had seen since capture. Their laughter was not just about food, it was about clinging to an identity, about mocking an enemy they could no longer defeat on the battlefield. And so, the first act begins not with silence or hunger, but with ridicule. A hall of men laughing at their captor's strange breakfast. Never suspecting that in just moments, that laughter would collapse into stunned silence, and then into something even more primal. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? The laughter lingered like smoke, but beneath it lay something deeper pride. For German soldiers, bread was more than food. It was identity, strength, the bedrock of discipline. They had grown up on dense loaves of Schwarzbrot, black and unyielding. Its heaviness meant to sustain laborers, soldiers, entire families in the Afrika Korps. Men carried chunks of it into battle, gnawing on it between firefights. To them, this was soldiers' fuel, proof of resilience and willpower. An officer at one of the tables, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Richter, leaned back with a smug grin. His uniform was frayed, the desert sand still embedded in its seams, but his voice carried authority. He slapped the table with his palm and declared, "We eat to fight, not to play." Around him, heads nodded. In his view, these pancakes, sweet, soft, almost feminine, were nothing but a symbol of America's softness. A soldier needed food that weighed in the stomach, that demanded effort to chew, that promised endurance. In their barracks conversations, many POWs repeated the same theme. They contrasted the pancake to their beloved Brotzeit, the traditional German meal of bread, sausage, and pickles. A guard later recalled overhearing one prisoner boasting that German soldiers could march for days, fueled by rye bread and schnapps. While Americans seemed content with children's cakes, that pride filled the air like a final defense, a psychological wall to shield them from the humiliation of defeat. But pride, in that hall, was also laced with denial. These men did not yet realize that their homeland was already cracking under shortages. By 1943, German families in cities like Hamburg and Essen stood in ration lines for hours, often receiving little more than ersatz coffee and bread cut with sawdust or potato flour. Meanwhile, These prisoners scoffed at pancakes as symbols of weakness, even as their wives and children struggled back home to find enough to eat. There is a cruel irony here in clinging to the toughness of their own bread. They only sharpened the contrast with what would follow. One corporal boasted to his table mates, "Our black bread has weight. It makes men." He tore a piece of memory from his mind, describing mornings in Bavaria when his mother laid out slices of rye with sausage thick as a man's wrist. His comrades grinned, nodding, even laughing at the thought. The pancake, by comparison, looked like nothing soft, golden air on a plate. It was this very pride, this elevation of their own soldiers' bread, that primed the scene for reversal. Their laughter, their boasting, their chest thumping all would crumble the moment their teeth sank into something unexpected. The hall quieted just slightly, as trays clattered down and knives scraped. Somewhere in that pause, the line between pride and revelation grew thinner, and soon, with a single bite, it would vanish. The first bite came almost as a dare. A young corporal named Dieter Hoffmann, only 21, smirked as he raised a forkful of pancake. Around him, the barracks air was thick with mockery. His friends egged him on. "Show us how children eat," he laughed, rolling his eyes as though preparing for a joke. But the moment the warm, buttery cake touched his tongue, his expression faltered. The smirk slipped. He chewed once, twice, and then swallowed with a speed that betrayed his surprise. Others watched with curiosity. A sergeant leaned forward, eyebrows arched, waiting for the punchline. Instead, Hoffmann dropped his fork, grabbed it again, and shoved another bite into his mouth. His face betrayed him no more jokes, no laughter, just the raw urgency of taste. Across the table, silence fell like a sudden curtain. The men who had been jeering seconds earlier now stared, uncertain whether to laugh harder or to reach for their own forks. Slowly, hesitantly, more began to taste. Karl-Heinz Richter, the officer who had boasted about German bread only minutes earlier, stabbed a piece with disdain. He chewed, and the disdain drained from his eyes. The pancake was soft, yet filling in a way he had not expected, its sweetness unfamiliar but comforting. Butter melted warmly across the surface, and syrup, amber and thick, slid down the sides. For men used to the harsh chew of rye and the bitterness of ersatz coffee, this was another world. The hall, which had been alive with mockery, grew strangely quiet. Forks scraped, knives cut, and the sound of chewing replaced the jeers. One prisoner, his face gaunt from months of war, closed his eyes as he swallowed, savoring as though it were his first real meal in years. Another, who had laughed so hard earlier that tears streamed down his cheeks, now shoveled food into his mouth as if afraid it might vanish. A diary later found in the camp records contained a brief line from this very morning. "I did not expect this. Sweet, warm, unlike anything in Germany." I laughed. Then I ate. And then I wanted more. The anonymous hand captured what so many felt, but could not admit aloud, the collapse of arrogance in the face of something as humble as breakfast. The camera lingers in slow motion, hands gripping forks tighter, cheeks bulging with hurried bites. The silence spreading like a tide. What had begun as derision became hunger. Then desire. Their laughter had evaporated, replaced by the clatter of plates being cleaned to the last smear of syrup. That first bite did more than still their jeers. It stripped away layers of pride, left them vulnerable, and set the stage for something even more startling, not just silence, but desperation. What began as curiosity quickly unraveled into chaos. The first trays had been cleared, the syrup bottles nearly emptied, yet the hunger only deepened. Men who had mocked and sneered minutes earlier now scraped their plates until nothing remained. The quiet that had fallen during those first astonished bites gave way to a different kind of noise, voices rising, hands reaching, trays slamming down for more. In the far corner, a prisoner stood and waved his tin plate toward the American cook line. His voice cracked, half demand, half plea, more. The guard raised an eyebrow but said nothing, signaling to the kitchen. Another man leapt up behind him, shoving his plate forward. Soon the line grew, ragged and impatient, men pressing shoulder to shoulder as if the pancakes were rations of survival, not symbols of ridicule. Arguments broke out at the tables. One soldier accused another of stealing an extra slice. Fists clenched. Voices hissed through gritted teeth. A sergeant barked for calm, but even he glanced at his own plate, almost ashamed at how quickly he had eaten. Two men nearly came to blows over the last golden wedge left on a platter, their struggle broken only when a guard stepped in, shaking his head with the faintest smile. A fragment from a camp letter captures the desperation. We laughed at them, then we fought over them. I saw comrades I trusted in battle push each other for another taste. It was shameful, but it was real hunger, or perhaps something more. The kitchen staff, mostly American privates assigned to the monotonous duty of feeding prisoners, exchanged knowing glances. One, a young farm boy from Iowa, muttered to his companion, "Guess they like it after all." The irony was rich men who had once marched under the swastika, soldiers who claimed the superiority of their culture, were now reduced to clamoring for a second helping of pancakes. The mess hall swelled with tension and urgency, the sound of chairs scraping, of trays being thrust forward, of boots stomping against the floor created a rhythm not of mockery, but of desperation. What had been a room full of laughter became a battlefield of appetite. The reversal was complete. They had come mocking. They now stayed begging. The most ordinary of foods had stripped them of composure and pride, revealing the human beneath the uniform. For the first time, the balance of power in that hall tilted not toward guns or discipline, but toward something deceptively simple: who would get the next plate of pancakes. Behind every golden pancake served in that Texas mess hall lay a truth larger than the camp itself: the staggering abundance of American agriculture and industry during the war. Each plate carried not only flour, butter, eggs, and syrup, but also a reminder that the United States was a nation that could fight on distant continents while still feeding its people, its soldiers, and even its enemies. By 1943, America harvested nearly 1.2 billion bushels of wheat in a single year, a figure so vast it dwarfed the combined yields of several European nations. Trainloads of grain rolled out of Kansas and Nebraska. Flour mills thundered night and day, and dairy farms poured rivers of milk into both civilian and military supply chains. From Vermont maple groves to Midwestern cornfields, the food system seemed inexhaustible. It was this foundation that allowed pancakes, dripping with sweetness, to be served not only to citizens at home, but to the very men who had tried to destroy that abundance. The prisoners knew the reality of scarcity. Letters smuggled from Germany told of children in Hamburg scouring alleys for potato peels, of mothers trading wedding rings for a handful of butter. They remembered bitter mornings in the barracks, sipping ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley or acorns. To sit now with plates sticky with syrup, surrounded by the smell of warm batter, was to experience a humiliation more profound than defeat in battle. At one table, a soldier whispered, almost to himself, "In Essen, my daughter waits in line all day for bread." His voice trembled, though he quickly hid it behind another hurried bite. His comrades stared at him but said nothing. Pride demanded silence. But the pancakes on their plates mocked that silence more effectively than any propaganda leaflet ever could. The guards, too, understood the symbolism. They watched the prisoners devour breakfast, knowing that each forkful carried its own message that America could afford generosity because it had no fear of collapse. One black cook from Louisiana, ladling batter onto the griddle, caught the eye of a German officer. The officer froze for a moment, struck by the sight in Germany. This man would have been invisible or despised. Yet here he was, feeding his captors with authority and dignity. It was a silent lesson about power and about a society that was more complex than the caricature painted by Ned's Eye propaganda. The pancake became more than food. It was proof, undeniable and immediate, of American plenty. It told every prisoner in that hall, this is a country so rich it can feed its enemies with sweetness, while your homeland cannot even feed its children. The irony was sharper than any blade, and it left them shaken. The hunger quieted into something unexpected, not just full stomachs, but a fragile thread of connection. For the first time since their capture, the German prisoners found themselves sharing something almost human with their guards' breakfast. The pancakes, golden and sweet, had stripped away layers of mockery and pride, leaving only men at tables, eating together in uneasy silence. One American private, a lanky farm boy from Ohio, noticed the prisoner staring at the syrup bottle clutched in his hand. With a shrug, he slid it across the table. The German froze, uncertain whether it was a trick, but when the guard nodded, He reached out and poured a thick amber stream over his plate. Around them, laughter rose not bitter this time, but soft, almost embarrassed. For a moment, war seemed to pause. In another corner, a black kitchen worker named Samuel Brooks carried in a fresh tray of pancakes, a German lieutenant, who only days before had boasted of Aryan superiority, found himself unable to meet Brooks's gaze. Here was a man he had been taught to despise, and yet it was Brooks who set down the food that silenced his laughter. History records no words exchanged, but the silence itself was heavy, a mirror held up to propaganda shattered by reality. That morning, gossip spread through the barracks like wildfire. Men whispered that the guards had slipped them extra portions on purpose, even chuckled at the sight of Germans licking plates clean. One diary fragment later recovered reads, "Strange. How quickly enemies can laugh together. They gave us syrup twice." We smiled for a few minutes. The war seemed very far away, and then came the arguments not against the guards, but among the prisoners themselves. Some insisted it was all manipulation, an American trick to soften their spirit. Others, mouths still sticky with sugar, asked the forbidden question aloud: if this is how they treat us as captives, how do they treat their own? Those words struck nerves. Ideological walls that had stood firm for years began to crack under the weight of pancakes and syrup. The mess hall had turned into a place of paradox. On one hand, these men were sworn enemies of America, captured fighters still loyal at least outwardly to Hitler. On the other, they had just accepted kindness from those same enemies. And worse, they had enjoyed it. It is here that the story stops being about food alone and becomes about the collapse of certainty. And to you, watching this now, imagine being in that room. Would you have laughed at the pancakes? Would you have refused them out of pride or taken a second helping, even if it meant betraying the beliefs you had carried into war? Let me know in the comments. The war would grind on outside the fences, but for many of the men inside that camp, the memory of pancakes lingered longer than battles. Months passed, then years. The routines of captivity hardened into rhythm work details, roll calls, endless hours behind barbed wire. Yet the small details etched themselves deepest, not the guards' rifles, nor the searchlights at night, but the morning when pride dissolved into hunger and laughter gave way to silence over a plate of golden cakes. Years later, when these men returned to a shattered Germany, many carried that memory as quietly as a scar. Bombed-out cities, ration cards, and hollow-eyed families awaited them. Yet some whispered to their wives about the American breakfast. One former prisoner wrote in 1952, "I remembered the pancakes more than any bread at home. Sweet, warm, absurd in their abundance. I dreamed of them." Such recollections found their way into memoirs, into letters never meant for publication, even into late-night tavern conversations where old soldiers confessed that the enemy had fed them better than their own country ever could. For some, the pancakes became a symbol of dissonance. How could a nation powerful enough to drop bombs that leveled Hamburg also afford to waste flour and butter on prisoners? How could men they had been taught to hate laugh so easily, ladle syrup so generously, share abundance so freely? These questions burrowed deep, unsettling certainties that propaganda had built. There is an anecdote told decades later by a former Afrika Korps sergeant, sitting in his garden with his granddaughter on his lap. He chuckled when she asked him about America. He did not speak of tanks or deserts or prison camps. Instead, he said softly, "They gave us pancakes. I never forgot the taste. It was the moment I understood we had been lied to." The child stared in wonder, not yet able to grasp how something so simple could undo years of belief. The image lingers, a slow pour of syrup glistening in sunlight, dripping over the edges of a pancake, catching the light like molten gold. For those men, it was more than food. It was proof of humanity, unexpected and undeniable, in a world where cruelty had seemed inevitable. And so the story closes, not on the roar of cannons or the signing of treaties, but on a breakfast table where enemies discovered a common hunger, and where the sweetness of pancakes became a lifetime's memory. History is often told through its battles, its generals, its victories, and its defeats. Yet sometimes the truest measure of a war lies not in the clash of armies, but in the smallest of moments, moments that live quietly in memory long after the sound of gunfire fades. For thousands of German prisoners held in the United States. That moment came not on a battlefield, but at a breakfast table, when laughter over pancakes turned into silence, then hunger, and finally reflection. The irony is profound. These men had marched under banners of hatred, believing themselves superior, hardened by the rhetoric of sacrifice and struggle. And yet, what disarmed them most was not the barrel of a rifle, but the softness of food they had mocked. A pancake, golden, warm, dripping with syrup, revealed to them a truth no speech could convey, that America's strength was not only in weapons and machines, but in the ability to feed even its enemies with generosity. Decades later, some of those men would still speak of that taste, carrying it as a symbol of contradiction. For them, the pancake became proof that the world was wider than the narrow cage of ideology. It showed that abundance could be as shocking as violence, and that kindness could pierce armor more effectively than bullets. There is something deeply human in this memory. The war was cruel, merciless, unforgiving, yet within its darkest chapters, fragments of compassion survived. A guard sliding a syrup bottle across a table, a prisoner, stunned into humility by sweetness on his tongue. These details remind us that history is not only about destruction, but also about resilience, dignity, and fleeting moments of connection. Perhaps that is why the story of pancakes endured, because it spoke not just of food, but of the possibility of seeing one's enemy as human, even if only for the length of a meal.